Technology is fighting me all the way on this one, but that's not going to stop us from talking about The Void Between Us, the new patch to Darkest Dungeon 2 that covers one of the cornerstone changes that Red Hook has been promising us for a while, Relationships 2.0. So without further ado, this is patch 0.18.41 something something something. As an overview, there's two main parts to what we're going to be discussing today. The first is the blog post that Red Hook put out. That includes all of the information about Relationship 2.0. I took some time to record some footage, so interleaved throughout that, I'll be showing you what these systems look like in-game, as well as talking about what they shared with us in the blog post. After that, we'll go over the patch notes, but I'm only going to do excerpts because there were a huge number of changes and I don't want to bore you with all the details. Either way, this patch is live now on experimental and will be live in the full version, the main version of Darkest Dungeon 2 early in January. So without further ado, Relationship 2.0. As a reminder, this is what the roadmap that they provided to us earlier looked like. They were planning on doing fewer, larger updates, but you can see that with the release of Relationship/Affinity 2.0 there in the M3 milestones, they have now completed all of the things that they set out to do in M1, M2, and now M3. We have the new playable hero, the Act 3 boss, story content, new cultists, Valley Variation, and Relationship and Affinity as of now. So, what exactly are we talking about here? First of all, they tell us that stress builds normally over the course of play, but we have brought back the tension of the original Darkest Dungeon's coin flip results. At max stress, heroes will most likely have a meltdown, but there is a chance they can become resolute instead. Unlike Darkest Dungeon 1, meltdown and resolute are not enduring statuses, rather they are moments of impact that can affect health, affinity, and character statuses. Beyond that, we have quirks and trinkets that have been overhauled in order to make them compatible with this new system and new meltdowns. Moving on to Affinity. We, along with many of you in the community, recognize that the previous system was a little too intrusive and not tactical enough. Our goal in this redesign has been to reduce the drag on play, the affinity gains and losses presented, and expose some strategic telegraphing to you in combat. Very excited about this. So first, all random after the fact affinity gains and losses in combat have been removed. That means no longer will you decide to punch a cherub and watch one of your relationships disappear. Instead, this has been replaced by a system that they are calling telegraphing. When selecting an action in combat, if the result will change affinity to another hero, then you will notice that change is telegraphed via an icon on said hero. This allows for more tactical considerations prior to executing the move. Dismiss is bleeding out, but you want to use the man-at-arms to guard someone else. Dismiss will make his displeasure very clear. In this way, we allow you to more actively sculpt your relationships through play. Our hope is this new strategy vector will gently encourage the occasional suboptimal skill choice in favor of affinity sculpting. Beyond that, though, they've also changed the way that the affinity scale looks. I'll put up a picture of it now while we talk about it, but basically, there is no more negative affinity. You will either gain or lose affinity. Affinity is now measured in pips 0 to 20, with the lower numbers indicating a poor or acrimonious leaning, while higher numbers represent a positive vibe between the heroes in question. The scale is broken up into 5 tranches, each labeled so it's easy to see how your people are feeling about each other. So I'll show that here, but basically you can see the continuum has a gray bar in the middle, 2 progressions in either direction from that, 2 yellow on the right, 2 blue on the left. And then basically, as you get more or less pips of relationship, you're going to see those relationships improve. But what does it mean to have good affinity? Because that's changed as well. So relationships. Relationships can now only form at the inn and last for the entire next region. After arriving at the inn, you'll want to purchase and or use your rest items to pump up your hero's affinities prior to hitting the rest button. You will then be shown what we're calling the embark screen, where you'll see the heroes looking out at the upcoming region. Looks like this. Any relationships that formed overnight will be presented here via click to reveal, much like the quirks that you get when you first enter the inn. High or low affinity heroes have the greatest likelihood of forming relationships of the corresponding polarity, but it is not guaranteed. Here's an example of where my grave robber and highwayman generated a relationship together. So as you just saw, the grave robber and Dismas entered into a relationship, and with that there was a highlighting of a new feature. When two heroes enter into a relationship, one skill from each of their kits is selected and modified based on the relationship. Negative relationships curse skills, locking them onto your skill bar in combat and placing a detrimental effect on the skill. Need to heal? Too bad, battlefield medicine will cause stress to the envious man-at-arms. Oof. Positive relationships will bless a skill, making them extra powerful with partner-centric effects like tokens, stress heals, or buffs. Thanks to a respectful relationship with the runaway, the leper's chop now has a chance to give her strength tokens every time it is used. In the example here, we can see that the grave robber, or actually it's easier to say Dismas, when using pistol shot will stress heal the grave robber, and there's a reciprocal one for Shadow Fade. This change essentially strips out the majority of the random act-outs, i.e. combat interruptions, and reintroduces them in a more tactically engaging way. You now have the ability to leverage a positive relationship to incredible effect or mitigate a negative one. Small-scale random relationship act-outs have been removed, as we mentioned, effectively replaced by these blessings and curses. However, positive relationships have two themed signature big act-outs. They are powerful and will interrupt combat and with a potentially expedition-saving impact. See here.
Collaboration confers advantage.
Because relationships last only for one region and then have a chance to reform at the next inn, affinity still matters. Arriving at an inn with low affinity between heroes who are in a positive relationship will most likely result in a new negative relationship forming. Here again is the embark screen, and this is what it looks like to embark in its entirety. Other notes. Many quirks that could possibly affect affinity relationships or meltdowns have been retooled to be more impactful. Here's an example of how Sanguine was changed. Direct damage was removed from certain combat items, preventing strength token consumption. General tuning changes and tooltip improvements for combat items and trinkets were done. This is very interesting. We'll talk more about it in the patch notes section, and then a few new items were added to the game. Stay tuned for an announcement about them in the new year. Now, this is already big. I think this is an incredible set of changes. And before we go into the nitty-gritty of the patch notes, just generally speaking, this makes things much more deterministic. You will have more agency to play around the negatives of particular relationships, but you will also have more opportunity to leverage positives of relationships. I think this is very smart. I also like the fact that not every time you hit max stress, you're guaranteed to have a meltdown. The occasional resolute proc feels really good. So overall, I think this is a huge step in the right direction, adds a lot more depth to the game, and is also going to smooth the gameplay overall. So I'm a huge fan of these changes. They feel great in-game as well. Now onto the patch notes. I'm not going to do what I usually do and go through every single line of the patch notes in excruciating detail. I think there's just too much here and it gets a little tedious and boring. If you're interested in the full details of the patch notes, there is a channel in my Discord, link in the video description, titled Patch Notes, where you can find all of the changes that I'm referring to here in all the depth that you want. Instead, I'm going to give a broad strokes overview. So first of all, trinkets. trinkets. This was a large balancing pass on trinkets. 68 of the 175 trinkets have been changed in some form or other. That's a 40% change to all of the trinkets. Some of the themes that I saw across the trinkets when I was looking over all of them is many trinkets were made more consistent. As an example, here's Simple Flower, which moved from having a 66% chance to heal and a 66% chance to block up to 100% chance of a heal and 100% chance to block. Also, certain critical items were massively buffed. So Sodden Sweater, as an example, had all of its ranks removed. So now it just gives 50% bleed and move resist. And the procs for resisting moves and bleeds were also stripped of their if conditional or their threshold conditional. So there's a ton more changes. I think probably what I'm going to do is a tier list of all the trinkets. We'll see. If that's something that's interesting to you, please let me know in the comments down below. But moving on, as for in items, nothing crazy has changed. The general observation that I would make is I think it's going to be a little harder to get people all the way up to the top of the affinity food chain, as there's more pips than you historically had to get. And I would say that broadly, they are also getting a little more stingy with those pips. As an example, playing cards took a hit and is now less likely to give positive affinity. Boxing gloves has a higher chance of giving a larger negative affinity hit. Morbid Joke is giving less positive affinity. So is Songbook of Amorous Ballads. So overall, I think affinity is slightly scarcer, and the amount that you need to get to that upper echelon is greater. As for combat items, the big change that they highlighted is the direct damage is being removed from all the dot style combat items. So Crow's Feet, Death Cap Spores, Incendiary Cocktail, Greek Fire, Ichor Bomb, Scrap Grenade, etc. The stated reason for this was so that it didn't take up strength tokens. That leads me to believe that it is still going to take up crit tokens, which I'm not sure I'm a huge fan of. But more importantly, the big reason that I'm worried or curious about this change is we will no longer be able to proc Death's Door with, say, a handy Bear Trap or something like that. It was really handy when fighting Exemplars and other high Death's Door enemies to get that extra proc through a consumable. So very interesting change. Not sure how it's going to play out overall. Outside of that, I'm not going to go through all the combat items, but a few that I think are worth highlighting. First of all the powders, Ablative Clotting and Neutralizing, have had a massive rework. First of all, they now give more resist, up to 66 from 40. On top of that, if you get a resist of that dot, due to the resist that they grant, you're going to get -1 stress from it, which is really nice. They do not stack as high. They only stack to 2 rather than 4, and their duration was reduced. But overall, I think this is a great change. I previously just used them willy-nilly in order to build a relationship. Now they might also be used situationally for a bit of stress healing. Next interesting one is the Pyrotechnic Dazzler, which I will be referring to as the poor man's smoke bomb from here on out. It used to give a daze and stun 50% of the time. Now it is going to be adding 2 blind or daze or stun or vulnerable or -4 speed. So it's kind of like a glitter ball that you can use on a random enemy on demand, but I think they're going to be a lot better. I'm interested in using them. And then last but not least, Shimmer Powder is now going to give 2 stealth tokens, and the speed buff is going to be a little slower, and the movement resist is going to be a little less. But overall, I think Shimmer Powder, this is a really nice improvement for those stealth using classes. As for Stagecoach equipment, the Surgeon's Mixing Kit is now going to give Healing Salves and Triage Kits. That's a big buff for it. I think Healing Salves remains one of the best items in the game, and the fact that you can now get them from the Surgeon's Mixing Kit is going to put it on my radar. Then there's a bunch of fixes. I can tell you from playing a little bit of the game in the testing phase of today's prep that the game is playing beautifully and really smoothly, but the only fix that I thought was worth pointing out is something that's come up a few times on stream, which is that heroes with memories now properly display their path as locked at the crossroads. This was a question of whether that was intentional or not, and given that it is listed as a fix, I think it definitely is. So, this is a big patch. Very, very excited about it. I think that it has huge potential. I think the new relationship system is going to be a beautiful addition to the game that really fixes a lot of the pain points that we've had so far. One of the things that I'm very curious about is to see how long the game plays for a full playthrough now that these systems are in place, because previous changes that they've made have shaved time incrementally off of how quickly you can play through the game. I expect this will do the same. And I think there's going to be a lot more depth. I'm curious to see how bad the RNG is on fully maxed out affinity turning into relationships. Like, are we going to get to the point where investing in all of that affinity doesn't necessarily guarantee us relationships? I'll be curious to find out. And also, are we going to have those blessed skills land on things that we simply don't want to use? But with all that said, I am super excited to play through this. If you are catching this video shortly after it went live on my channel, I am very likely playing Darkest Dungeon 2 on stream. So feel free to come find me and come say hi. I'd love to have you. But other than that, hope this was helpful, and I'll see ya in the next one, which may very well be a Trinket discussion / tier list. But for now, that does it for me. Have a good one. Bye-bye.